Oh, why, hello. I didn't see you there. um, an extra input on my interface. I figured it'd be kind of awful to not use that for something. My name's Jeff Emtman. I am going to do something that is akin to a live stream, but it's not fully a live stream because I actually did a live stream of the content I want to cover today last night. But because I'm home, like everyone else, I'm using equipment that I don't normally use. And unbeknownst to me, the whole 2 hours of this live stream, I was sounded like I was underwater, and I was like clipping out every just like couple seconds, and people were too nice to tell me. So today, in the bright light of morning, I've done some more tests. I'm going to just record the same content I covered last night, but offline. You know how that is. Just a few less confounding variables here. So. Actually, let's go back to this here. This was part of a thing that Podcast Makers Weekend put on, Podcast Maker Weekend. And they asked me to come on and talk about podcast editing in Reaper. Now, I've been using Reaper for a really long time. I make a podcast entirely in Reaper. It's a podcast called Here Be Monsters. And it's a show that I've been making since 2012, I guess. Yeah, just right after I got out of college. And it's audio documentaries, you know. We just put an episode yesterday. Stuff about fear, mostly. I'm afraid of a lot of things, so it's stuff about fear. And I like to build sounds up around the people and the subjects I'm talking to and about. So I've been using Reaper. I think it's a fantastic piece of software. For the whole time I've been making the show, and it's something I want to share some tips with you during the next. I think I'm going to keep this to about an hour. I might try and split this up into 2 different episodes. Time will tell. So even though this isn't a live stream, it's going to sure as hell seem like one because I'm not going to go back and redo things like I usually do when I'm making YouTube videos. Anyways, as you might know, I do have a series on YouTube that is called Reaper for Radio. And Reaper for Radio is kind of this very beginner-paced set of tutorials. It's, 5 to 7 tutorials long, depending on where you want to count the end point. It's something I made years ago, but it was actually pretty well received, I think, because a lot of the stuff I was talking about was stuff I was learning as well. And I'm a couple of years past that now, of course. And so now I'm starting to make these tutorials be a little bit more intermediate skill level focused. So if some of the stuff that I'm talking about, like the basics of like splitting and cutting and deleting audio and stuff like that, if that's seeming like intimidating to you as you watch this video, what I want you to do is to just, pause this, come back to this later, and go and watch the first 5 videos in Reaper for Radio. I'll put a link in the description here so that you can find just how to get up and running with the software. And this class, or live stream, or pseudo live stream that I'm doing now is going to be split into 3 major chunks. Now, the first part of that is highly related to Reaper for Radio, in which I'm going to give you just kind of the crash course on it, just like here's the most basic things that you should do to Reaper to get it up and running for you as a podcaster. The second part is going to be about making a template for podcast editing, something that you can use on every project as a starting point. And the third part of this is going to be really kind of the what they say, bread and butter of it all, just the stuff that I've learned in the last 9 years of using this software, the little customizations, the little tweaks that makes my life so much easier when I'm putting together like especially more complicated projects. So I'm going to kind of walk you through some of my edits as I have this one piece that I think will be pretty useful for you. So before we hop into all of that, though, I do just want to talk just briefly like why do I use Reaper, right? Now, the first thing is that when I was getting out of college, I didn't have money to spend on software, and I learned a lot of Pro Tools in college. Actually, not a lot, just kind of the basics of Pro Tools in college. And I thought it was cool software, don't get me wrong. But I remember when I got out of college, I looked at how much it cost, and I was like, absolutely no way. And I was trying to edit something at home, and I was like, there's no way I'm affording this. So really the first thing that brought me into Reaper was the price tag, which, I fully admit I abused the freeness of the trial a little bit longer than I should have. It's a 60-day free trial. It's full featured. It's very generous as is. And then, they don't lock you out after those 60 days. Of course, the software is not free, but it is almost free at $60 compared to what you're spending on a lot of other pieces of software. And that gets you 2 full major upgrades. So I gave them $60 in 2012. And I just only recently had to re-up that license when Reaper 6 came out here recently. And I've since made my whole career off of this software for the large part. So I actually wound up buying the commercial license, which is $300, which is still quite a steal compared to especially a lot of the subscription-based software alternatives that we have out there. So it was really the price tag that first got me in, and I'm not going to deny that by any means, but it was pretty soon after that I realized that all of the stuff that I was trying to do in Pro Tools, I was able to do in Reaper as well. And in some circumstances, I was able to do it much better. And I remember the first thing that boggled me was in Pro Tools, why do I have to make stereo tracks and mono tracks? It didn't make any sense to me. And the thing that's really cool about Reaper is you can put anything anywhere. You can put stereo items on any track you want, mono items on any track you want, doesn't care about bit rate, doesn't care about sampling rate, doesn't care about bit depth. You can just put anything anywhere you want. You can even drag pictures in, for God's sake, It's a very agnostic software as far as what you do with it. It just wants you to do stuff. It doesn't really care how you do it. And so that was really interesting to me, coming from a much more rigid piece of software like Pro Tools. Another thing that drew me to it was the stability. I might have Reaper crash on me, I use it every day, maybe 5 times a year, I highly recommend that you set up automated backups in Reaper. That's a very wise idea. But it is way more stable than any other piece of software I've used, I think sound or otherwise. Software is buggy, and Reaper, for the most part, does what it says on the tin. And a lot of the times when it does crash, it's actually the fault of some dodgy plugin that I got off the internet. So it's very stable, yeah. And the thing that's the main part of it that draws me to it, and this is what I'm going to be talking about mostly in this tutorial or pseudo live stream or whatever you want to call it, is the adaptability of the software. And this is also a downside for some people, because you can change almost everything in the software. Again, Reaper doesn't really care how you do stuff. It just wants you to do things. So it can be a little bit overwhelming at first to see all of these options that you have available to you. And I do think that it's software that is more well suited to someone like me, who, I played with a lot of Legos as a kid. I really loved tinkering with little things, taking things apart. That is definitely my default perspective on things. And I sometimes falsely assume that everyone else enjoys taking things apart. And sometimes people just like stuff that just works and they never have to think about it. They never have to fiddle with anything. It just kind of works. I think there are some other pieces of software on the market that are more tuned to that mindset. But for someone like me who really enjoys learning, really enjoys feeling challenged as I learn a new set of skills, I think that Reaper is this really beautiful onion that kind of reveals another layer of complexity to you, then reveals another layer of complexity to you. But when you first open up the program, you don't really have to think about too much, because it just kind of works on that level too. So all this to say, I'm pretty proud. I think I've converted, a large handful of people over to the software over the years. And because they're, spending either $60 or $300 on the software instead of thousands of dollars over the course of their career, I feel proud about that. It's I know people in our industry don't always make a ton of money, and to know that they have a little bit more in their pocket and are able to produce really high quality work, that's something I'm proud of. So I should say, though, that I am in no way affiliated with Reaper. I'm just someone who bought their software years ago and have become a little bit of an acolyte for it, and maybe that's what they'll write on my tombstone. I'm not sure. Okay, I hope not. I hope I do something. I hope I do something else with my life. I guess I'm making this podcast, So again, we're going to be talking about this stuff in three main chunks. First main chunk, we're going to be talking about basic Reaper settings. This is kind of an incredibly distilled version of Reaper for radio, the YouTube tutorial series that I have. And then we're going to be making a template for podcast editing, just something, a good starting point for every project you have. And then the third part, which will be the biggest part of this, is where I'm going to take you through the progression of an edit from the blank project that you start all the way through to the finished piece. I'm going to do that by going through versions of an episode. It's actually the one up on the screen here. We'll talk more about this in a minute, but it's versions of this episode 128, which is about someone who learns to see auras and questions that ability as he becomes an adult. So without further ado, I just want to hop into Reaper here. And this is what I would call a vanilla install of the software. There have been no changes to it. I actually just installed this a couple minutes ago. And one thing that's really nice about Reaper is you can install multiple versions of it on your computer. So I have my own version which has all my customizations in and whatnot. And I can also install a second version to show you what things look like out of the box. So I just dragged 2 pieces of audio from that episode in here, and I'm not going to be talking about like the basics of like importing audio and splitting stuff and whatnot, because that's covered in other tutorial things. But I just dragged these things in here, and I stacked them on top of each other. I don't actually know if this sounds good. I've got 1 track of voice, 1 track of music. Let's just play this.
So he said the first thing you'd have to do would...
So yeah, nothing really special here. It's just 2 tracks of audio playing on top of each other. It's kind of the basic stuff. The phone is ringing, but we're not going to pick that up right now. So let's go through some of the basic things that you would want to change just to get working on a project, right? First things first, and this is something you should always do, is you should always turn off the grid. And the reason for that, I'll show you here. Let's zoom in a little bit. Zoom, zoom, zoom. So you can see that when I move this audio, it's going chunk, 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 and that's because it's trying to snap to quarter notes. And guess what? This project doesn't have any quarter notes because we don't really need quarter notes. So I'm going to turn off the grid, and now you can see when I move this back and forth, move smoothly. So again, grid on, it's this one right here. You can always hover over these tools and it'll tell you what they do. Grid on, chunk, 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 chunk. Grid off, smooth. So that's the first thing. What else are we going to do? We're going to switch the time base of the project, just the way that the ruler displays time. So all you have to do is, so you can see up here right now, actually let me zoom in. This will be a little bit easier for those of you on small screens. Zoom, here we go. Up in the upper left up here, or just the whole top of the project, you can see that we have these kind of confusing numbers, and that's similar to what we were just talking about, where this is showing like bars and beats and measures and stuff like that. We don't really need that. We need the second number down here, which is minutes and seconds and milliseconds and hours and stuff like that. So all you have to do is just right click and switch it from measures beats over to minutes seconds. Those of you on Macs will know how to right click on stuff. I think it's, was it option click? I think it's option click. Or maybe alt click, or I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm kind of bad at Mac stuff. Okay, another thing. Let me zoom back out here. And there we go. Another thing we should change is we should change the default zooming behavior. And I'll show you, I don't know, this is maybe just a personal preference thing, but I think this is kind of a stupid way it comes shipped out of the box. If we zoom in, regardless of where my mouse is, we're going to zoom in on the edit cursor, this blue line here. So I'm using a scroll bar here to zoom. Scroll wheel, whatever. Scroll wheel to zoom. And you can see we're zooming straight in. The cursor's always going to be in the middle of the screen. I actually don't really like this behavior. I like to be able to zoom where I'm pointing, because where I'm pointing is where I'm interested in editing, if that makes sense. Luckily, this is a really simple thing to fix. All you have to do is go into Options, Preferences, Control P works as well. And I don't actually ever know where stuff is in the preferences because there's a lot of them, so I just search in the little find bar down here. So I'm going to do zoom, and when I hit find, it will show me any preferences that have the word zoom in them. So first one, not this. Second one, oh, okay, here we go. So it's not vertical zoom we want, but the next setting is the one we want. So horizontal zoom center is by default set to edit cursor or play cursor. And instead, if we select mouse cursor from this drop down, now you can see that when I try to zoom in over here where there's nothing, I can zoom over here where there's nothing. Or if I want to zoom to the very start of the project, I go to the very start of the project. And if I want to go right where the edit cursor is, I just put my mouse over the edit cursor and zoom in. And that's as hard as that is. It's actually a very simple setting to switch. You only have to switch it once. So there's plenty of other things in the preferences you should play with sometime as well. But that's one of the easy ones that you can fix out of the box. Another thing is that we as podcasters almost never need the mixer. The mixer is useful in very rare circumstances that I've found, because most of what we need to do can be done in this main view, and the mixer takes up like a third of the screen or more even. So let's get rid of that. Now the easiest way to do that is to just click this little X down here. Let me zoom in on that. Let me zoom in. Oh, whoops. There we go. Let me zoom in and look at this. I can just drag that down. That's pretty cool. I haven't used this software before, and I'm still getting used to it, this recording software. So what we can do is to see this little tiny X down here, I can just click that, and we've got rid of the mixer. Now, if we ever want it back, it's pretty easy to get back. Let me just pop over here. It's pretty easy to get back. We can just go into View and Show Mixer. You can see that's Control-M or Apple-M for Mac users by default. So we can always get back if we want. But while we have the mixer here, I actually just want to show you something really neat that I find to be very useful, which is that the only good thing about the mixer is the master meter. I think the master meter is nice because you can see how loud your stuff is summed from all the stuff. And if it's very possible to have stuff that's all fine per track as far as levels go. But when you add them all together, you might wind up clipping. So I like to keep an eye on the master level. But I don't want to have this whole business taking up all my screen. So what you can do is you can just right-click anywhere on the master meter and go up to Master Track. And then you can say Show in Docker. And the Docker is this extra window that you have that you can put anywhere on the screen. And you can put whatever you want in it, including the master meter. So if I do this, it's going to give me this little new tab down here. And if I take this tab and I drag it, you can see I could just drop it as a floating window here. If I leave it here, I can lock it to the top, to the left. I like putting it on the right side. You can see that blue bar that lights up when I drag it over here to the right. And when I do that, and now if I close the mixer, and if I hide myself, whoops, there we go. You can see now I've got the master mixer over on the right-hand side of the screen. And if I play back stuff now, let's hide that mixer. There we go. If I play back stuff now.
Feel your body against the floor.
Yeah, not bad, right? And what this is this is just all the effects that are on the track. And since there's no effects on this track, we don't really need to see that. So I can just drag this up and away. And that's as hard as that is. Now, just a couple other changes here. One thing that you should do, and I'm just going to tell you to do this, I try not to speak in directives too much, is you should download this thing that is called SWSS&M. And what this is an extension for Reaper, which lets you do a bunch more things. Let me show you something called the actions list, just very briefly here. So the actions list is actually one of the coolest things about Reaper. And what it is it's this list, and you can get to it from actions list or just by typing a question mark in on your keyboard. It's this list, and I'll make this big because it's very long. I would wager, just ballpark range, there's maybe 10,000 things on this list. And this is everything the software can do. And what's so useful about this is that if there's something you want the software to do that you don't find a button for, or something in the menus, like something I sometimes show people is like random color. If I have something selected and I say if I say item set to a random color and I click run, it will set that item to a random color as many times as I click this. And so anything that's in the actions list, you can set as a keystroke, you can put it together into a macro, like string a bunch of them together. And this is going to be crucial for the second or third part of this video, where I'm going to be showing you some of the custom actions that I've put together. And it's things that are oftentimes much more consequential than a random color, although this can be quite useful too sometimes. So, something that like I would change is that actually here's something that we should do that involves the actions menu. So by default, when you hit the V key, it will show you the volume envelope for the track. Now, volume envelopes are great, but the problem with volume envelopes is that they don't give you any visual feedback, right? So like, say I want to adjust the volume of this clip here. Well, I could, put in volume points by holding shift and clicking, and I could drag this down, I could drag this up, and now this word is going to be quieter than the words around it, right? That's fine. So, but I can't actually see any difference. And one thing I would generally do when I'm editing is I would, I would pull down the music while the voice is playing. Again, fine, but I actually can't see any difference here, and that's because of kind of a quirk of the way the volume envelope works. That is logical, but too boring to explain, if that makes sense. Like, you can look that up yourself if you want. I'm not going to bore you with that right now. There is another kind of volume in Reaper, though, and that's called the volume pre-effects envelope. So let's show that by clicking this button here, which shows all the track envelopes that you can show. By default, you only have a couple, but anytime you add an effect onto the track, any parameter of that effect will be available on this list, which I'll show you later. So what I want to do is I want to show you the volume pre-effects envelope. And again, the volume, like, it's not parenthetical here, but this is the volume post-effects envelope. And again, for reasons too boring to explain to you, that will not show you visual feedback of your changes. However, the volume pre-effects envelope absolutely does. So let's click to show that. You can see I've got this new brighter green line here. So I'm going to make this track a little bit bigger. We'll scroll down just so we can see it better. I want you to see what happens now when I change this. So putting in 4 envelope points, going to drag down the middle. You can see I can make it quieter there. I'd even make it louder at the end. Louder in the beginning too if I wanted. And you can do this ad nauseum. And I think this is a much more efficient way to edit volume, because you can actually see what's louder and what's quieter, and you don't have to necessarily open up this volume envelope every single time. Now, the thing about this is that by default, you would have to go in here, click this X to show or hide it every single time. And I don't think that's very effective. So what I think we should do is I think we should change the V key to show us the volume pre-effects envelope instead of the volume post-effects envelope. So I know that's a lot of words, but it's actually pretty easy to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the actions list, and I'm going to search for the V key, because I already know that that's a volume envelope. Find shortcut V. So by default, that is set to toggle track volume envelope visible. Now, I kind of assumed that the pre-effects one, it's one of these up here, but the actions list is really long. So you can also go in here and you can type, I want to toggle volume here we go. Track, toggle volume pre-effects envelope visible. That's what we want. So this is a good one to pay attention to. And when it says down here in the bottom left-hand corner, shortcuts for selected action, I'm going to click Add. I'm going to say, I want to use a V key. Type the V key. I'm just going to say, OK. And it's like, are you sure about that? Because this is already mapped to something else. And I'm going to say, yeah, let's do that. So now let's close. I'm going to hide this envelope. I'm going to hide this envelope. Let's hide this envelope too, just for fun. And now, when I click here and I click the V key, we have our volume pre-effects envelope. I click it again, it goes away. Click it here for this track, volume pre-effects. And you can do this as much as you please. I think it's a really nice feature to have that visual feedback. And that's something that you see in some software and not in others, but it's in Reaper, you just have to set it up to work the way you want it to. You could use any key you want. I actually sometimes still use the volume post-effects envelope, the default one, for purposes too boring to explain. And I just have that set up to a different shortcut that I can remember, because it is still useful sometimes. Similarly, you can add any effect you want, or you can add any action you want. And so something I do a lot is add a bunch of tracks all at once. And I think by default that's Control T, but I want it to be faster, so I'll just make it the T button, right? So let's say new track. Here we go, insert new track. Yeah, not Control T, let's do just normal T. Again, it's going to say this is mapped to something else. It's a feature I don't really use, so that's fine. So I'll close it. And now, if I need a bunch more tracks, we can hide that. Let's make this smaller. If I need a bunch more tracks, I just go T, 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 and I have as many tracks as I want, you know? So the actions list, right? This is a little bit of a digression, but it's some useful changes that you should probably make. The actions list is great. It's something that I've never seen in another piece of software before, and it's very powerful, and it's kind of the core of why I've stuck with this software, is because there's just so many powerful things you can do with that. And to that point, this thing that's called SWS S&M is this set of extensions that puts like another 10,000 things on that list and lets you do some super powerful things. Now, again, later in this video, I'm going to show you some things that require you to have this installed. And it's a pretty simple install. It's free. You can donate if you would like, but it's free. You download it and you follow the install instructions. I think it's just a matter of clicking a couple buttons. And then you'll have a bunch more things in your actions list. You just have to restart the program before they show up there. So that's one thing you should install for sure. And if you're feeling saucy, you can also get this thing called ReaPack, which is also free, and you can donate if you'd like, which is kind of similar to SWS, but it's like more advanced little programs that run in the software. And I'll show you one of them that I really like that lets me very easily color things. It's called ReaNoir. And the thing that's nice about ReaPack is you just download this thing once and install this thing once, and it keeps all of your little pieces of extra software up to date. This one, I'm not going to walk you through going through. It's a little bit more of an advanced setup, but just so you know, this is a recommended. I would consider this so good as to call it required. And it will be required for some of the things I'm doing later in this video. Those are kind of the basic modifications that I recommend everyone make. Let me just clear out all of these items here in tracks. And I want to go through the basic process with you of setting up a podcast editing template. So the main thing you need to know is that tracks are tracks are tracks in Reaper. There is no difference between any kind of track, except maybe the master track, but there's you don't have to worry about like what kind of track is this going to be. Reaper just kind of handles that for you. So I'm going to go ahead and hit T twice, because remember that's my shortcut, TT. And I'm going to make this a little bigger so I can rename some tracks. Let's make the first two tracks be mute tracks. And what mute tracks are tracks that are muted. I don't know if that's like an official word. It's just something I've seen a lot of people doing, just kind of intuitively. People figure this out. This is really nice to have just a couple muted tracks in your project. And what you use this for is as a soft delete, so that if you have a piece of audio and you're like, I'm pretty sure I don't need this, but I don't want to have to go find it again later if I do need it. This is where you can throw audio that is like probably not going to wind up in the piece, but you don't want to get rid of. Okay, so we've got our two mute tracks. You can have as many as you want. Sometimes I'm using a bunch of these, and they can be small. No one needs to see them. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to make a vocal folder. Whoops, that's not where I wanted that. We're going to make a vocal folder. And what folders are in Reaper is they're special tracks that hold other tracks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a couple more tracks here. I might have like two voices in my project. And if I select both of them and drag them into the folder, look at this blue line here. Maybe I should zoom in on this so you can see it better. We'll zoom. Okay. Let's look at this blue line together. So I have two tracks selected again. I just do that. Click here with Shift held down. And if I drag these tracks, I can of course reorder them, right? But when I bring them up to this other track, what I can do is I can pull it in a little bit. And look how that blue line indents. So again, here's normal. This just reorders the tracks. But if I pull them up here and a little bit to the right and a little bit up, you can see that blue line indenting. And when I put it in there, they stay indented. And what that means is that this track is now like a part of this track. It's like a sub track kind of. So how you do this normally is like, if I'm on one track and my co-host is on another track, say there's like a certain amount of compression that I want applied to all the vocals in the episode, or there's a certain EQ, or like I want reverb on everything or something like that. Instead of going through and adding it to my track and adding it to Beth's track, what I do is I just put it here on the vocal track, and no matter what, that will be applied to anything that's like one of its like children tracks, right? Any track that's in that folder. So this is actually really useful for keeping projects organized. I'll show you another example here. So like I also use a lot of sounds in my work. So I have a sounds folder. And in the sounds folder, let me zoom out again here. in my sounds folder, I would have, maybe like three sounds, three soundtracks. And so again, I could put like reverb on this. I could put other kinds of processing on this, just on this sounds folder track, and it will be applied to everything within. So I would call this S1, S2, S3, sure. Why not? Let's zoom out a little bit vertically so we have more space to work here. So we've got that going, that's great. Now I also make a music folder. I make a lot of the music for my show. I know that's not something everyone does. So when I'm exporting like music for the show, I export like an instrument at a time. So if I have like guitar on one track and drums on another track and like a synth sound on another track, I'll export those each individually so I can stack them and kind of mix and match them as I go along. So like for me, I use a music track. I use a music folder, and so I would drag this in. We call this M1. The names are whatever you want them to be. And that way, whenever I'm like trying to duck stuff underneath voice, then I can just affect it here. And actually, I'll probably show you that here in just a second. But you very well might find this irrelevant if you're only ever using one track of music or something like that. This would not be necessarily something you want to clutter your project up with. But for me, I do this. And let's actually, let me just drag some of that audio we had in there previously back in. Let's just snag, I don't know, a little bit of music here. I'll drag that onto this track, M1. Maybe I'll drag, something else in. This is probably gonna sound like garbage, but you'll get the idea just fine. And let's just drag in that same little bit of audio from my source in that piece, Colby. So if I play this together, we've got two tracks of music, right?
So he said the first thing you'd have to do.
Right. And what I do is that when someone's talking in my pieces, I will pull down not only the volume of that audio, but I will also pull down the high frequencies because I think it clears up a lot of space for like voice to shine through without like letting the music cloud up the space. You can still keep some of that power there without cluttering up the things that you need to like intelligibilize the voice. So the way I do that is just with an equalizer, right? So in this, I'm going to go ahead and grab the default Reaper equalizer. Oh, there we go. And that's called ReaEQ. And I'll just drag this either onto my track or into this empty window. You can see this is labeled as a folder track. So I'll close that out. And now I have my equalizer, and when I play back the audio, because these two tracks are within this folder, we'll see the readout over here. Okay, but here's the thing is when he's talking, I want it to sound more like this. You hear the difference there? There's no high frequencies left in it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to automate this this up and down. And this is something I do all the time in my projects. So what I'll do is just by default, I want kind of up here at the top. But if you go into this parameters menu here, this is the easiest way I found to do this. If you click that, it'll say last touched thing. And that's the frequency of the high shelf. Great. Let's show an envelope for that. Okay. So we have a new blue line down here. And this is the default position, which is letting everything through. And when he starts talking, I want to start fading that down. Okay, it's like that. And now everything that's in the tracks below is going to be faded down, those high frequencies. And we should probably also fade down the volume a little bit too. So let's do that. A little bit, maybe just, I don't know, 3 decibels, 4 decibels.
So he said the first thing you'd have to do would be to feel your body against the floor. A narrow beam of light.
So yeah, it's a subtle way of creating more space. Again, like if I fade this all the way down, you can hear what happens. how it fades down from the top end. And one thing that's nice about the recent release of Reaper is that you can actually embed the visual part of certain plugins in the track control panel. This is totally optional by all means, but I'm just going to hide the grid. Great. And if you right click on certain effects, not all effects, but a lot of the default Reaper ones, you see this little option that says Embed UI in TCP. Let me show you what this does. This is pretty cool. Okay, nothing's changed yet, but that's because we don't have room for it. So what I can do is I can drag my music folder out. Look at that. Now, if we want, we can see visual feedback of what's happening with our effect.
So he said the first thing you'd have to do would be to feel your body against the floor, to imagine a narrow beam of light come.
So it's kind of nice, right? Not required by any means, but it's nice to have. So that's something that I do in every project. For my music, I always have a high pass, low pass, high cut filter. A low pass filter, high cut filter, same thing. But again, we're making a template here. We're not actually cutting a piece together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete all this stuff. Delete. I'm going to select all these. Delete. I'm going to get rid of all this. Delete. And we don't actually need to see these things by default. This will just be when we're editing later. Hide, hide, hide. Don't need you. Delete. And this is like a fully serviceable Reaper template. Taking this one step further, and I'm just going to kind of briefly glaze over this, is something called return effects or send effects. What this is often used for is stuff like reverb. And, I should probably just make a whole video on this. I talked about this last night, and I realized this was probably a little bit too advanced for the video, but I just want you to point your eyes out to these buttons here that say route. And this is a really powerful feature that Reaper has that lets you send audio from one track to another. And so you can kind of think of this as like a cable that you drag. So when you click it, you're now dragging. You can see there's like a little tiny plug that shows up. And if I plug it into this track, everything from this track, this music track, will wind up on this reverb track as well. And the reason why you would do this, I'll show you why. I'm just going to close out this window. Is if I want to put reverb on a particular track, let's just grab the default reverb. So now there's going to be reverb on this track down here called reverb. And because all the audio from this track is going into this track, then all the music will have reverb on it. And you're like, why didn't you just put this on the music track, Jeff? And the reason is because I can also drag all this stuff from the sounds folder or an individual track in the sounds folder or all my vocals as well. And then you're like, why would you want to put reverb on your whole project? And the answer is you don't. What you want to do is you want to start thinking about some more of these envelopes you have down here, because in addition to all these things that you can show envelopes for, you also have send envelopes now. And if I send some volume from my music track into my reverb track, I can very precisely control how much reverb is happening at any time in the particular project. And you'll see this in either the second half of this video or the later half of this video here in just a moment. Again, I don't want to go too far into this just because this stuff can get really confusing really fast, but just know that it's very possible to send audio from one track to another for further processing. And in this case, I'm talking about reverb, but you can also do this for things like delays or other kinds of kind of spacier sound effects. And I think I'll probably make a whole video on that topic here one of these days. So for the time being, though, let's just get rid of that. I think this is a totally serviceable Reaper template. And now that we've got all these boxes checked, all these different things that we've done, we've got a nice low pass filter ability on our music channel. We've got our volume envelope set up right. We've got the grid turned off. We've got the mixer hidden. We've got that looks kind of ugly. We've got our ruler changed to minutes and seconds. There's only one other thing I want to show you, and this is something that will seem totally useless right now, but trust me, this is really cool. So a couple minutes into the project, or I don't know, let's go 5 minutes into the project, I want you to make 9 markers. Insert, what is it? Marker. By default, that's M. You don't have to put a name on them or anything, at least not yet. I'll do M, 4, 5, 6. There we go. 7, 8, 9. Don't have to be super careful with this, you know. You could color them if you want. You could color your tracks if you want to. And then I need to make 2 more markers. And this time we do need to name them. We're going to go insert, marker prompt for name, which defaults to Shift M. And we're going to call this, and this is very important, equal sign, all caps, start. A couple minutes later, minute later, it doesn't really matter at this point. We'll be adjusting this stuff later. Insert, marker prompt for name, equals, all caps, END, end. And now we're ready to save our template. Zoom out a little bit so you can see everything real nice there. Here's our template. So what a template is a template is essentially a read-only Reaper file. And I'll show you how you can use that here in just a second. So you go File, Save, we go Project Templates, Save Project as a template. It'll prompt you to save this somewhere on your computer. By default, it's the folder where everything's going to be looking for templates, so just use the default folder. We're going to call this Podcast. Hit Save. Now I can close this project. It's going to say, you didn't ever save this project, and actually you did. Close project. Don't want to save that. Let's go now. We have our blank slate again, just the default. You can see the grid's on. You know, the time base is all wrong. Doesn't matter, because we go Project Templates, load the podcast template. We're good to go. We're right back where we were. And now what you do is you just go ahead and you build your project in here. And when you hit save, it's going to be like, where do you want to save this as an actual project? Because you're not going to be overwriting this project template. I think it's actually a really wonderful way to work. And I think I kind of think of these templates as like living documents. You know, I update mine about once a year with new little things that I find that I want for my starting point for every project. So this is kind of the halfway point here. Yikes, I've been talking for 45 minutes. I think I've got another 45 in me, so at this point, you know, when I'm editing this, I'll decide whether to continue this on as a single video or to split it off into a second video. Oh, maybe I should show that little video again. Here we go. Look at that. I was proud when I made this. So you can consider this like either your intermission or maybe a good stopping point for the day, but this is kind of the hard break point between the first half and the second half. In the second half, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at this project I made. I'm going to be showing you why I made all those markers, especially, and how to scoot audio around so that you can keep track of what's your good tape and what's your bad tape, and how to very quickly visually identify that. So, you know, take a little break, stand up, stretch, you know, listen to some calming synth music, and I'll be back either in part 2 or in another video. Calming was maybe a bit of an overstatement. Oh, yikes. And we're back. You know, I live on a street next to a stop sign, and I don't think I'm ever going to be calm again after I see how fast people slam on their brakes when they get to the stop sign. It's like oftentimes like the whole car lurches like several times on their way to a incomplete stop. I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and I hope I'm not like breaking some like cardinal rule here, but I think every city I've lived in, the people have driven worse than the previous city that I've lived in. I also live on a one-way street, and about 6 times a day someone drives down it the wrong way. It's I think I shouldn't live next to a street anymore. I think that's the moral of this story. Anyways, this is part 2 of this live stream, in which we're going to be talking about Reaper project workflow. And in the first part of this video, what we were talking about some of the basic modifications that you can make to your Reaper configuration. And as well, we were also talking about setting up a template that is like a good starting point for all of your podcast projects. Both of these things I think are really essential to editing with the software in an enjoyable way, although it's certainly possible to just take stuff out of the box and make things work as well. But I'm going to show you kind of the steps from very beginning to very end of a recent episode that I made about maybe about 6-10 months ago, something like that. That episode, actually, let's look at it real quick. Where is my web browser? There we go. That episode was episode 128 of Here Be Monsters. It was called Seeing Auras, and it's a very beautiful piece, actually. I was in Winnipeg, and someone had emailed me. His name's Colby, and he was a listener, and he told me this really wonderful story about, well, I mean, not wonderful, it's tragic, but this very beautiful story about the days after his mother's death, when he was a kid and being taught to see auras by one of his mom's friends from childhood, and then growing up into an adult and trying to figure out like whether he believed in auras and what he thought they might be. Colby is a visual artist. He works with video, specifically like VHS feedback. And I was trying to make the interview kind of, there's these kind of like ghosts sometime that you can get in audio that I find very beautiful, these kind of little remnants of things. And that's what video feedback is all about, is about these kind of blooming colors that can emerge when you like feed things back onto themselves. And that's fundamentally what an aura is. And all those things are very connected in his mind. And I think it's a really wonderful piece in the end. But it all comes from just one interview that I did. It was like, I think, an 1.5 hour long interview. And so I just want to show you kind of what my process for making this piece looked like. Now, one thing is that in the first half of this video, we're using what I was calling Reaper Vanilla, the basic version of it, but this isn't actually how I edit, because I've been making customizations for so long now. So I'm going to actually close out of this. I'm going to open up my own installation of Reaper, which is what I've kind of been iterating, consistently for a while. And it's going to look a little bit different, but most things are going to look the same here. You can see the colors are a little bit different, the toolbars are a little different, but the main strokes of everything is still the same. I do have SWS and ReaPack installed, which we talked about in the first half of this video. But aside from that, like you might a couple times be like, what's that cool button you got there, Jeff? But aside from that, it's all the same. So let me open up just my first version of this. This is my own template that I edit from. It's very similar to the one I was showing you earlier. It's a little different though. Yeah, we got a couple different track names and stuff like that. What I have started doing in this project though is I've started keywording the audio. And this is one of the things that I do differently in my workflow from a lot of people, and it's something that I will advocate for documentary work, but not all kinds of work. And what I do is I do not use transcripts. I actually kind of loathe transcripts because they take forever to make, and it's really hard to identify audio that is good tonally versus just the words that are being said. And so something that I do in my work is I try to focus more on the things that sound good, as opposed to things that, like, written on the page make the most sense. And the reason for that is because we're in a sonic medium, and so I try to keep things sonic as much as possible. So what I do instead of writing transcripts is I will keyword all of the audio, and I'll mark it by what kind of tape it is, whether it's story tape, whether it's kind of meta level like administrative tape, whether it's good tape or bad tape or truly essential tape. So what I do is I go and I listen through all of my raw audio, usually, I mean, honestly, at like 1.5 speed, because I'm not trying to write word for word transcripts. What I'm trying to do is just figure out the main strokes of things. So, oh, I actually just remembered something embarrassing. I'm going to pause this for just a second and unset a setting. Okay, I'm back. I just saw something that would be a little bit confusing that I want to demo here. So, yeah, I just want to show you my process of going through and sorting tape. And you should develop your own workflow that makes sense to you by all means. I just want to show you how I found to make these things make a lot of sense. So first things first, the main thing that makes this a lot easier is zooming in a little bit. Let's go ahead and look at some of the things that I've written here in the very beginning of this interview. I use the pound sign for administrative tape. So here we're like setting up the recorder. I'm slating the tape, saying where I am and who I'm with, what the date is, just some clicking sound. I actually don't know what that is. I'm telling him that I'm not allergic to cats or dogs, that I like friendly cats, and he's telling me his cats' names are Chanel and Cleopatra. I asked him, about the origin story of the cats, like these sort of things. Now, I use the question mark whenever I'm asking a question, or whenever I'm actually just speaking in general. So I tell him about how my mom has tamed a couple stray cats. Here I've recorded the sound of his cats purring. I thank him for emailing me, to tell me his story, these sorts of things. And I would just go through, and again, on like 1.5 speed, not taking any amount of real time on this, I would just mark like the good tape. Like here's an exclamation point, which I use for good tape. And I say, I had asked him, I'd kind of said a little disclaimer of like, I'm probably going to mess this up. Like, I can't promise this is going to be a good interview. And he says something that seems important as I'm listening back. Similarly, over here, I can see this green exclamation point marker. When he's saying that he needs to remember how to be more open about his self and his life. So I can really easily identify after the fact what the good tape and bad tape is. This bright green is a $sign, which means it's essential tape for the piece. And I had asked him why it was hard for him to talk about his mom, and he says that he just doesn't have a lot of memories of her, that's something that, was going to wind up in the piece almost certainly, because it was very central to the things we were talking about. So, the way I would be doing this is I'd be listening through, and I have a custom keyboard shortcut set for, insert a marker wherever the playhead is and prompt me for its name. I just use the comma key, cat meowing loud, if his cat started meowing loud and I couldn't use that tape, right? And that goes in. And what you'll see is that as I put in the markers, I use a XX to denote like bad tape, like tape that I can't use. You can do whatever you want on this front. Actually, I have it in my notes here. Let me just show you what kind of markers I use. I use an exclamation point for good. I use the $sign for really good. I use a XX for bad. I use the open and close brackets for the starts and ends of stories, and I use the pound sign for structural, and I also use the question mark for whenever I'm talking, whenever Jeff talks. So you can do this stuff manually, and I actually used to do this. The reason for doing this, let me just show you the region project manager. Where is it? I can never find it because I have these like keyboards these shortcuts so ingrained in my mind. You can probably see it, and you're probably yelling at your computer screen. Oh my goodness, there it is. Wow. So the thing is that like if I want to find any tape about his mom, I just type in mom here, and then I can see here the only markers I have so far are the ones that I've the one that I just added, but also my questions. But I can just scoot the edit cursor to wherever any of these are whenever I click on this, right? And, I only have a dozen or two markers. I've got like 45 markers in the project at this point. But what I'm going to show you in the next section is how this can be extremely powerful. So one thing that you've noticed again is that these markers color themselves, and this is an SWS thing. You can find this under extensions, and it's called Auto Color Icon Layout. Yikes, what a mouthful. And here are just my 8 rules that I've set, which is that if I use an equal sign, it will set it to a certain color. If I use an exclamation point, it'll set it to a certain color. If I use a double X, it'll set it to a certain color, and down, so on down the line. Now, if you want to make one of these rules yourself, what you do is you click Add Rule, and you'll say, this is rule number 9. And what do you want to apply this to? I'm going to say, let's apply this to a marker. And I'll say, let's just color any tape about his mom, or anyone's mom. This will be in all of your projects from here on out, mom. And I can right click here and I can set color, and let's just make that like a nice bright yellow. So when I say OK, now the thing about this rule set is that it's not actually going to apply this until I scoot this up the line, because these rules are, I don't know what you say, like hierarchical. So it will the higher on the list, the more important the rule is. So I need to actually move this up because these mom markers are already tied to other rules at this point. But if I move this up to the top, you can see instantly this marker was recolored as yellow. And I should have at least 2 other bright yellow. Yeah, here we go. Here's one of them. And that's because the word mom is in there. So it's a way of really quickly visually identifying what certain kinds of tape are. Again, if I use the region and marker manager, I can sort things by their color. So if I want to see all my good tape together, that's a really easy way to do it. I can also sort by name. If you don't want to deal with the whole SWS thing, you can also just manually recolor a marker by clicking on its color. I think you can also do that by right-clicking as well. Edit marker. Yeah, you could say color manually this way. This is just a really nice way to do everything automatically. Now, another thing that you might have noticed here is that it's kind of a pain to look at this. This is not like a fun reader-friendly interface, but if you drag this down, we can show them on lanes. And this is much easier to read. And if you still are like not overlapping in this way, in the right way, you can just right-click here, and you can say, I set this up so long ago, I forgot how to do this. Oh, ruler layout. Here we go. Wow. Display project markers in lanes. You can do the same thing with regions. The thing you need to know about regions is regions are just markers over a period of time. You can think of it that way. So if you make a time selection and you say insert region, edit region, good region. There we go. And you can do the same sort of thing where you can set up those auto color rules and whatnot too, if you want. I find this a really helpful way to label my tape so I can visually identify it quickly, much quicker than a transcript, because it's also searchable and I can move my edit cursor around very quickly by searching for the right things. Let's go on to a little bit further, right? Let's go into version 2 of this. I label all of my drafts, or anytime I change something significant, I will increment the file name. And the way you do that is with what's called save a new version of a project. It's in the file menu here, and they'll just tack a incremental number onto the end of your project. And it's a really easy way to do version control, because I know that the higher the number, the more recent the draft, and that's as hard as it is. I don't have to think about dates or anything like that. It's just version 2 is always going to be newer than version 1. And in this project, I used 15 versions. I just kind of save them whenever I make kind of a big change. So it's another way of like kind of security and like knowing you're not going to mess anything up too bad. So at this phase, I have gone through all my raw tape. It's an hour and 45 minutes with a lot of like boring stuff on the tail end. You can see, just by looking at the colors of it, you can see how the course of the interview went, right? This is kind of fun, actually. You can see that I was doing I think it's the bright yellows. Oh wait, no. What is it? The dark yellows are my questions. The dark greens are good tape, the bright greens are really good tape, and then the red is bad tape. So all the good stuff was in the middle, and it's kind of tailed by mediocrity on either end. So it's pretty easy to see the course of a interview going, you know what I mean? Anyways, this is the full version of the what I call live transcript at this point. And again, it's super easy for me to identify what certain tape is just by either scrolling through this list, going through the timeline, typing in cats into the list so I can find all the cat tape, that sort of thing. So what I want to show you is the next step after you have all of your tape labeled, essentially, right? One thing that people get confused by sometimes in Reaper is how markers are tied to the project. And what you need to know about markers is markers are tied to a time, not an item. So there's no way to tie a marker to an item. And you're like, that kind of seems like it defeats the purpose because I'm going to need to know what this tape is later. And to that, I'm going to show you the solution. But let me just demo that real quick here, in that if I make a split with the S key, and I move this around, and I move this around, you can see those markers stay in place. And it's really easy to mess up all of your markers if you're not careful. Because another thing to pay attention to is if you have ripple editing on, only if it's on for all tracks. So this is off. This is ripple editing per track. This is ripple editing for all tracks, right? If you have ripple editing on for all tracks, it will move markers with. And this is how, like, you see what's happening right here. This is how you really mess up all your markers. So I know that I just told you to spend a bunch of time making markers, but the way I work is I leave all of this alone, all of this stuff alone. This kind of exists off in its nice little raw tape zone. Some people make their own project for just raw tape. I actually don't like that workflow very much, but I know some people that do it. But what I do is I just leave the markers alone, let them have their space over here, because they're tied to time, not to items. So the way that you keep ideas with individual clips is you just rename the clips, right? So when you're first listening, you're not necessarily sure where like the starts of ideas and the ends of ideas are. But because I mark every time I ask a question, when I'm doing the next step, what I'm often doing is I'm often just pulling out one of my questions and the full answer or part of the answer to that question, and kind of labeling it appropriately. So let's find a question here. Let's go over to, I don't know, the middle of it where I start asking good stuff. Well, I'm going to try and not do anything too dark in here. I kind of have a limited selection of audio here because I'm away from my main studio. So unfortunately, there's like some tragic stuff in here. We'll try and skip that. Okay, let's go in here. This is fairly banal. This is some tape. I don't see my question in here, but we're just going to kind of pull something from the middle. This is some tape where I was asking him about a photograph that he had with this guy who taught him to see auras. His name was Santo. And there's this photograph where Santo's holding this camcorder, and there's another photo being taken from a balcony, I think. And in the middle of the image, there's this kind of grayish haze that's covering Santo up a little bit. And it looks a lot like a light leak from like a cheap camera, but at the same time, like because of the context of like what Santo was teaching Colby, like there's some questions about is that coincidence sort of thing. So say this was like a clip that I thought was pretty useful for the piece. What I would do is I would split it off, and I can kind of see the progression of this. Like there's some mediocre tape in the middle, but I can see I'm asking a question right around here. And so what I'd probably do is I'd probably just listen to this real quick and try and find a real broad chunk of audio that I wanted. Now, what you have to do before you actually start moving stuff around is you have to decide the main themes of the project. So what I would want to do before I actually did this is I want to go over to these special 10 markers that we made over here, 9 markers, right? I want to establish the like very basic themes of the piece. So because I've heard this tape, because I know what it is, like obviously some of this is going to be about mom. Oh, that Reed changed the color because we made that special rule. You can ignore that. Some of this is going to be about auras. Some of this is going to be about belief, certainly. I might make a whole section just for like the Santo story, like the what happened that day. So I might make a section for Santo, and then I always reserve the last one for sounds. Not a lot of sounds in this piece, but there's a couple, you know. So that's just going off of memory. I'm not sure what I actually did for this project, but so these are our 5 options that we have. We have mom, auras, belief, Santo, sounds, and I'm going to go back, find that tape we were just looking at over here. And so Santo was section, oh, I forgot already. I usually write these down so I can remember. Santo was section 4. So I have this real cool little custom action made that's called Clip Dumper. That's what I decided to call it. And what it does is it takes this audio and it moves it into a little bin, like a little storage area, a little holding place where everything is thematically sorted. So what I do is I do Control 4 because it's going to go to marker 4. And it's like, what do you want to name this? And I'm like, this is, this is about visiting mom's friend. It's about Santo holding camera and haze. So when I hit enter, you see the view flashed for just a second, then it brought me back here. And you can see that this little clip got colored green. It got renamed to what I said. And then if I zoom out and go back over here, look at that. It got dumped in section 4 with the same name. And so now I know what this tape is about. And this is probably something I would wind up using in the project. Let's go over here. Looks like there's a lot of good tape here. This is where he's like in the current day, like trying to figure out if he believes in auras or not. So, I'm just going to pick this arbitrarily, but this obviously looks like something good. And I would listen to it and check kind of the start and end points. But this is about seeing a green aura, right? And so I would go over here. It looks like auras is section 2 or bin 2. So I do the same thing, except I do Control 2. And it says, what do you want to name this? I'm like, let's name this green powerful aura. Well, aura. Yeah, great. And so I could keep doing this, we could do like snakes. Let's, pretend this is something else about auras. We could call this purple aura. Purple aura. Okay. And so now you can see again, our raw tape is getting colored. And over here in our middle section, essentially, the next section of the project, we have these clips that are nicely color coded so we can see what theme they're associated with. And they also have these names that are tied with them forever. And so even if you split this, even if you move this is always going to be called snakes, right? And similarly, we have something called the project bay. And I don't actually really use this, but some people find this useful. In the project bay, I use the project bay, I just don't use it for this. You have a list in media items here of all the different media items in the project. And once you go through and pull out all of your good clips, you'll have a big, nice list here. And you can, very quickly, it's very similar to the region marker manager. You can do snakes. And then you have this clip called snakes. You can play it. You can also even just drag it straight into the project somewhere else. And it's quite a useful tool. And you can do this for anything, obviously. But what's important to know is that item names are stuck to the items regardless of time. Markers are stuck to the time regardless of items. And so you use them for different purposes. So how do I do this little trick, this clip dumping trick? Well, I want to show you kind of... This is my magnum opus, my Reaper magnum opus. I'm going to open the actions list. I call these things clip dumpers. And these are custom actions that I've made that do exactly this, okay? So I have 9 of them because I do this with 9 different little sections in the timeline. That's why it's important that we made those markers that were markers number 1 through 9, because these actions rely on that. So this is something, I don't know, maybe you want to like screenshot this and recreate this on your end or adapt this for your purposes. But here's how this works. And this is going to seem a little complicated, but what this action does is it pulls up these like 8 or so other actions in this order. And this is an SWS thing. It saves what I'm looking at. It changes whatever is selected to custom color, number 1. It lets me rename the items all at the same time. And this is important because you can actually clip dump multiple clips at once, especially if you have like a phone interview or something where you have like 2 tracks on top of each other. You select them both and it will rename both at the same time. Then we essentially copy the items. Then we go to marker 1, we paste the items, we go back to the edit cursor where we were before, and then we restore that view that we saved at the very beginning of this action. One thing that's really helpful is this little tick box down here that says consolidate undo points, because if I decide that I made a mistake, I can just hit undo once. instead of undoing through each one of these steps, which is a real bummer when you do it. So if you make this, I highly recommend considering checking this button called Consolidate Undo Points. And so I have one of these for each of the different 9 clips, and they kind of take a little while to set up, don't get me wrong, because you kind of have to do it manually. But once you have it set up, you don't ever really have to deal with them again. It just all works the same way. So here's clip dumper 9. And the only thing to know about this action is that ripple editing has to be on for it to work. Otherwise, they all stack on top of each other, which actually Reaper can handle just fine. It just kind of turns into a mess. So that's clip dumping. You can also do this stuff manually. I did this stuff manually for years. I just kind of eventually figured out how to automate it through custom action. So now we have the middle section of the project done. I'm just gonna check my notes here, but I think that's it. Yeah, let's look at version 5. This is kind of like a cooking show where there's the like casserole that was made earlier by some like poorly paid intern. Thing about podcasting is you get to be your own intern. You know what I mean? So here's that middle section. Here's all of my clips, all properly labeled and ordered. It looks like the sections I chose were Mom, Santo, Auras, kind of meta stuff where I'm talking about like the future with him and other things, alternate realities, skepticism, introduction, that sort of thing. And then of course these other sections here, I've labeled these in ways that make sense to me, knowing the tape. And again, they're very easily identifiable, kind of the broad strokes of what's in any audio. Again, I find this much more advantageous than a transcript, because even though like I might have to go hunting for a particular sentence every once in a while, I can very quickly identify what the content of a whole section is instead of, word for word. It makes it a lot easier to find tape most of the time. So I've got, I had an 1.5 hour long interview, and it looks like I decided about 50 minutes worth of it could potentially wind up in a piece. What I consider this is usually I try to have about twice as much material as will wind up in the piece. And it looks like I edited even tighter in this case. I don't think there's too much to show you in here, just that this is kind of the middle step of the project. And you're like, Jeff, this seems like a whole lot of setup for making an audio piece. But the thing that's really wild is like, once you get into this workflow, once you do it a couple times, it becomes really second nature. It takes a lot more explaining than actual time to do, because especially the second pass of going through and finding your good tape, a lot of that you just do visually. You can see. I think, obviously like doing the initial keywording takes 75% of the time the interview took, because if you're listening at 1.5 or 1.25 speed, that saves you on some time. And then I think that the next step of sectioning these things out probably takes, I don't know, maybe half of that time, because you can already figure out where you can just skip over this whole end section. I wasn't saying anything interesting. So let's move on to the actual piece. The editing is, of course, what takes a lot of time, but having really well organized tape is a huge help. So the actual workflow, right? I'm not going to go into so much on like the layering of sounds and like the reason I chose certain effects over other effects, that whole thing. I'm missing a couple files here because I'm not at the office, unfortunately. I'm at home. Nothing too crucial here. I have myself a little note that I had enabled feedback routing on this project, and feedback routing is by default turned off in Reaper for good reason, because you get some real awful screeching sounds. Feedback is, again, this thing where you're feeding sound that's playing back into itself and making this like loop of sounds on top of it. And it's actually really fun to play with. It's very organic and unpredictable. But you can really get some terrible screeching sounds. So I left a little note to myself to be careful when I'm editing. Here's the actual piece, right? So you remember those start and end markers that we had made previously? I build my piece within those start and end markers. And these are very special markers. These are markers that Reaper understands to say like, hey, I know you're, 2.5 hours, let's zoom all the way out. You're 2.5 hours into this piece. When you render this, what do you want to actually render? And if you make these special markers, it will say, it will ignore everything that's not within these two. So I can show you in File, Render. If I do time selection, I can render whatever I want. You know, if I make a time selection here, you can see there's 5 minutes or whatever. But if I get rid of that time selection, and you know, this piece again was like 20 something minutes. If I instead just say entire project, you can see right here, 20 minutes, 33 seconds, and some milliseconds. And if I adjust this end marker or this start marker, you can see it adjusts the time accordingly. These are really helpful. They're of course not essential. You can always just make a time selection and export your thing, but I am honestly like a huge proponent of not making your pieces at the beginning of a project, because A, it makes zooming hell, because you often wind up like not being able to zoom further left, and B, it just gives you a lot more space to work. So it's this kind of like 1, 2, 3 punch of like raw tape over here, good tape over here, and the piece towards the end. And then off to the right of the end of the piece, I'm often just using this as like a scratch pad, kind of just a dumping ground for stuff that I'm not sure if it'll work or not. And similarly with the mute tracks, you can see I use them a number of times, actually not as much as I normally do in this project, where there's a couple things floating around up here. And if I ever want to hear something, if I'm like, this transition isn't working, it just needs a little bit more tape, I often just scan around in the mute tracks and see if there was something that I forgot. Easy way to do that is just to solo it, and it will mute everything else and just solo the muted track temporarily. Then I can unsolo it and go back to normal. So what did I want to show you here? Yeah, I was doing some fun feedback routing in here. Actually, let me show you what that is. Just, I mean, not necessarily because that's what the purpose of this is, but I just want to show you what that sounds like, because it is pretty fun. What I did is I had send set up, right? We talked about that in the first part real briefly, and that's that pink line down here. And whenever I'm sending audio down to this reverb track, the reverb track is actually also sending it into this feedback track, which is looping audio back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between these two tracks. And if I pull this up too high, it starts screeching. And if I pull it up just high enough, it will start making some really cool feedback stuff. So I'll play you just a little tiny section right here.
In the dark, I was a little embarrassed about what I was doing in the corner of the couch, and I would, do it when I was alone or when I knew no one was watching.
What he was talking about there was like, I think it's something we actually all probably did, which was if you push on your eyeballs a little bit, you can see these kind of blossoming patterns, the eye doctor will not tell you to do this, but it is, I think, something I did as a kid for sure. He's talking about how like when he's seeing an aura, he's kind of seeing these patterns that are like when he used to like bury his face in the couch and push the cushions against his eyelids. I used the feedback routing a couple times in this piece, Let's see what this is.
And to cover my eyes with my palms.
That's a little bit more of a subtle one there for sure. Feedback is interesting because it's very unpredictable, and it's something I actually really want to work with more. Yeah, that's not the point of this live stream. Sorry. My kind of rule for thumb for editing is that like it should be making my face do something when I'm editing. And so if I'm like frowning or smiling or smirking or laughing or like cringing, like that means that it's like a evocative choice. And yeah, I think that's why I find feedback compelling, is because it usually makes my face do something. So I want to show you here that kind of middle section that we were doing earlier in the last version I showed you. I have it set up so that when I copy something out of this section, it turns the audio white so I can see what I've used and what I haven't. So there was like a clip right here. Let's look at this one. There was a clip right here that I didn't use. Is where he was talking about his mom's interest in alternative medicine. It was something that in the original audio I thought was interesting, and then I was actually constructing the piece. I couldn't find a place for it, and I decided the piece was stronger without it. But you can see that actually more so than usual, I used almost every clip that I pulled out of this piece. Usually there's quite a number of untouched audio in this section. And I must have just been very judicious. I mean, you can see how many trims, like how many little cuts I made here. Looks like I was very judicious in my editing down of certain sections in this piece. But I think I pulled almost everything from my selects, what I call them, my selects, and dumped them over here. The way I did that was with just a very simple custom action I made that copies an item and turns the original white. And this is something that'd be super easy to set up. I think I actually did it. I just kind of intuited it last night. What you do is you'd make a custom action that says copy, right? Let's just find a basic looking, gosh, there's so many. Copy item. Here we go, edit copy item. And so you'd make a custom action with this, and then you would just say item white. And you can set whatever item is selected to white. If you ever want to like test these things out, so I said item copy, right? Item copy. Let's just try it out with this one, this little piece that didn't wind up in the piece. So copy items, do that. And item white. Come on, computer. And we do that. So now I've turned that white, and I had just copied this previously. And so when I, go over here, if I'm just going to dump this out, we now have that item, same color as it was originally, but the version from the selects is white. This is, that's something that's just icing on the cake. That's not necessarily necessary by any means, but it is something that is helpful. And what's nice about retaining the original color is that I can also very easily identify in my piece what each part of the piece is about. So red is his mom, yellow is Santo, green is, what is green? Auras? I think green is auras. And then we go back to some stuff about Santo, and then here's kind of the big level stuff about like time travel and alternate universes and the big picture stuff. So you can actually see the visual progression of a piece thematically as you go, and I think that's a pretty compelling way to edit, because you can see flow a lot better. So just another couple little things here before we wrap this. I want to show you one thing to make your life a little bit easier, which is you can see that even though we're 2.5 hours into the project, the piece still starts at 0, and all of these times before that 0 point are negative. And the way you change that is in the project settings. So like say you want the piece to start over here. If you want that numbering to start over here, it doesn't affect this marker or anything, but just where you want the numbering to start. You go into project settings under file, and then you can go into the general project settings, and then you can set wherever the cursor is to 0. So if I did it here, then the timeline starts from here. And you can see everything before here is negative numbers, everything afterwards is positive. But generally speaking, you want that start number to be wherever your start marker is. Gosh, I've been talking for too long and I've like kind of lost my words. Here we go. Okay, a couple other things. These are some super helpful things, right? So I've been talking a lot about using envelopes to affect effects, if that makes sense. So like one that I'm doing a lot is I'm affecting that high pass filter, the low pass filter, high cut filter, whatever you want to call it. So the way I do that is I use the tilde key. So I can show all of the envelopes that any track has using the tilde key. And I can hide all the envelopes that a track has using the tilde key as well. And let me show you that action. Find shortcut, tilde key. My computer is getting very slow right now. Here we go. And so that action is toggle show all envelopes for tracks. And so any track that I have selected, this will let me show or hide all of those envelopes. So this is really useful because oftentimes when I just need to pull down the music for a second, I just need to see this high pass filter. I don't know why I keep saying that, high cut filter, low pass filter. I just need to see that frequency read out for just a moment. So you can see I have it here. So I can just, oops, there we go. I can just hide and show that as I please. And it'll also show me here my volume and my send out to that reverb feedback track. You know what I mean? So hide and show, hide and show. That's as simple as that is. And if I have multiple tracks selected, God forbid, I could show it for all of these tracks as well. I try to keep my track envelopes to a minimum if possible, because they can really clutter up the interface a lot. Another thing that's interesting about track envelopes is that track envelopes, like markers, are tied to time, not items. And it's just kind of important in your head as you're like learning to edit better, and you get more advanced with this stuff, is to kind of try and separate those things out in your mind. So when I'm working with music, I'm very often using track envelopes. And the reason for that is because I care about the timing of the music, not necessarily the notes of the music so much, right? Because like whether or not it's like a C or an F doesn't really matter to the listeners so much as whether it's on top of a piece of vocals or not on top of a piece of vocals. So I'm much more interested in pulling down this frequency when Colby's talking than I am about the actual content of the tape. Something I do all the time, and I mean all the time, is I'm changing vertical track heights. You've probably actually seen me do this a couple of times subconsciously. It's just kind of burnt into my brain. I have it set up so that if I type a capital A, like Shift A, it will maximize whatever track I'm looking at and minimize all the other tracks. So if I do Shift A, I can look at this track real nice. I can see the details of it, but I can still see every other track around me. Similarly, if I do Shift A up here, I can see my vocals track. If I do two tracks at once, which I often do, I can see both those tracks at the same time. But usually I just have this on the vocal track. And this is another custom action that I've set up. This is a built-in one. You don't have to do anything fancy for it. I'm going to do Find Shortcut. I'm going to do Shift A. Let's see, what did I set it to? It is View, Expand, Selected Track Height, Minimize Others. And again, if you want this for something, you would just go Expand, Selected. There we go. And you could type as much of that as you want. And then you just go ahead and add whatever shortcut you want. I use Shift A. It just makes sense to me. Similar to that, I also all the time use another shortcut which maximizes every track underneath the edit cursor at any point. So you can see right here I have my vocal track and I have 3 of my music tracks. So if I hit A now, and that's what I just use the A key, it will minimize every other track and just show me what's under the edit cursor. Similarly, if I go over here where I just have my vocal 1 music track in this room tone loop, similarly you can see here that it will maximize that. If I just do the vocals, it's a little bit much because no one needs to see that much waveform at any given time. But if I go over here, it's a very easy way to see what is actually playing at any given moment, and I'm doing this one constantly as well. This one is a little bit more advanced, and I think this is about 80% stolen from a really wonderful resource that I highly encourage you to check out called the Reaper blog. I usually watch the videos on YouTube, but there's also an actual web page that has a lot of written instructions as well. The person who runs it is extremely generous with his time and has helped me out of a couple fixes before, because he's very smart. His name's John. And Reaper blog is fantastic. And I think this was a video from about a year ago where he explained how to pull this trick off. It's a little bit more advanced. You have to make a custom action for it, but here's how to do it if you're interested. So I called it Maximize Tracks Under Cursor. And here's what you do. You zoom out vertically entirely so that every track is minimized, essentially. You select all of your unmuted tracks, because I don't want to be maximizing my mute tracks because I'm not usually looking at those. You move the edit cursor to the play cursor. That's what it is. Use this SWS thing called Select Items Under Cursor on Selected Tracks. Select only tracks of selected items. Vertical zoom to selected tracks, minimizing others. Unselect all tracks. Unselect all items. Unselect all tracks. This is such a wonderful thing. I would never figure this out by myself, so I'm very grateful to John for helping me out with this, because this is super helpful. I would highly recommend you get something similar set up on your own. because it'll save you a lot of trouble. One thing that I wanted to show you, this is something from ReaPack, I'd mentioned this earlier, is this really wonderful ReaPack extension called ReaNoir. And I have it mapped to the Z key because I use it all the time. It's a really easy way to color items. So you can click something and, pick from your custom palette over here. Yeah, sure. You can also pull the color from an item, get color. And now I have this one loaded up here. And if I go over here, I can just do that. You can also you can make something darker. You can make something lighter. You get the idea. Get color. Let's go brighter. Of course, I've just ruined this nice looking little section here, but you can see how this could be really useful. And I just pull this up with the Z key. Once you have ReaPack installed, all of the extensions that are built into it just wind up in your actions list as well. So ReaNoir. It's just, this wonderful free script that someone, donated to the community. And you'll find a lot of people in the Reaper community who are extremely generous. And, I try to make as many of my resources free as well, because it's not like we don't need to get paid. But I have taken so many free things from the community. And I hope that some of these tutorials are a way of giving some of that back to people who've been extremely generous to me and people who are just learning this stuff for the first time as well. So let's just, in 2 minutes, recap what we talked about here. Reaper is fantastic. It can be overwhelming at first, I get it. So much of making a workflow is going to be personalized, and just because something works for me does absolutely not mean that it's going to work for you. But I think this software is so powerful and so cool because it's kind of like an unending project, and there's something refreshing about knowing that you're never going to know everything and being okay with that. And that's kind of how I feel about Reaper, is that there's always going to be additional layers to this software. And the thing is you don't have to know a whole lot to be really good at it, though, if that makes sense. Those first five Reaper for Radio tutorials, I made those in 2012. I'd only been using the software for a year or two, and people have really latched on to those and found those to be valuable. I think in part because I was very open about admitting that I didn't really know what I was doing, and I still don't. And I think it's totally fine to mess around with this stuff, because there's always an undo button, and there's always the nuclear option of just resetting Reaper back to its default configuration, which I encourage you to do, and just kind of get that fresh slate again. One thing that's nice about Reaper too is that at any point, I recommend you do this pretty regularly. If you go into the Reaper preferences, go into general here, there's an option here to export your configuration. So if you do have stuff that you like that you don't want to lose or worried about messing up, you just click this button. It will generate this whole configuration file for you, and then you can save that somewhere on your computer. And if you ever want it back, you just go import configuration, and it will prompt you to load that file up. So yeah, don't be afraid to tweak some knobs and whatnot. Another thing, that I've not touched on at all here is the concept of mastering. And I know there's a lot of confusion around these terms in podcast worlds, but there's a big difference between what we're doing here and what's called mastering. So what we're doing here is called mixing. And mixing is where we have these many tracks all layered on top of each other, a bunch of effects happening, a bunch of complicated things happening. Mastering is the process of, you have your mix finished, you have the basic idea, the whole thing done. Mastering is where you export out everything from this session into just 2 tracks, left and right stereo. And then you do your very final volume adjustments, maybe some light equalization, maybe some compression. That's a whole separate process. That is a real can of worms. That's something that I'm very unqualified to talk about, although I sometimes do. There's another video on my channel that talks about mixing and mastering. It was done in a Q&A format. And I kind of run through my basic settings for that. I just want to make sure that you know that what I recommend doing is I recommend doing a mix session at a comfortable volume, not 100% freaking out about levels and stuff like that, then exporting it into a mastering session where you do kind of get a little bit more anal retentive about when things are peaking, where they're peaking, and stuff like that. Granted, all these things take practice, and that's something you'll just get a lot better at. So with all this being said, I really appreciate you hanging out with me here for, well, what on my end was an hour 45, but on your end is hopefully going to be more like an hour 20, because there's plenty of trimmables in here, you know what I mean? I just want to say again, like, you know, this is something I do quite a bit of, and I do tutoring. I teach this stuff institutionally sometimes as well. And if you have any questions or requests for like future tutorials in this series, of course, like leave them in the comments, because I'm always trying to further my knowledge, and something that helps me further my knowledge is learning along with you. So yeah, feel free to leave a comment, reach out to me if you want like personal tutoring. Or one thing I'm working on right now, hopefully, is kind of a default Reaper configuration that people can download that will kind of get you along the way, like get you started in some of this stuff, so you don't have to, you know, make 9 clip dumper operations. But that's something that might be a little ways out. I'll obviously post about it here if that's the case. But I was really thankful for Podcast Maker Weekend for reaching out and saying, you know, it seems like there's people interested in this stuff. Would you be interested in sharing some of what you've learned? And it's a pleasure, of course. It's a pleasure to have you here with me. So that starting soon doesn't make any sense at this point, does it, Jeff? Let's do that. Yeah, like that. Yeah, that's better. Yeah, that'll work. That'll work. All right. Thanks for hanging out with me here, and good luck with your editing. It was a pleasure. Oh, maybe we'll go out on a musical note. Let's get some more garbage on the feed. There we go. Oh, now we do this. Yeah. That's good enough. All right.